Hello everybody, welcome back. This is going to be chapter 16, part 2. We are continuing our discussion on the endocrine system, and in part 2 we're going to take a look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Alright, so this is the part where we're going to start exploring specific hormones by name, and what I would highly recommend you do is as you're taking your notes, make yourself a little table, and in the table you want to write down the hormone name, you want to also write down its location of synthesis and secretion, and then you want to give yourself maybe like a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of the mechanism of action, and if you do this, it will basically help you keep track of all the different hormones that we're going to be discussing. And as I mentioned in part 1, by no means are we discussing every single hormone in the body, but we are going to give a really nice little intro, and we're definitely going to be discussing the main hormones. And without further ado, let's jump on right in. So part 2 of our lecture will take a look at the hormones that we can find in the hypothalamus and in the pituitary gland. So first things first, let's go ahead and see exactly where the hypothalamus and where the pituitary gland are. They are located in the brain, and if you go ahead and take a look at the illustration on the bottom of your slide, you can see right here the hypothalamus is located towards the bottom half of the brain, right over here, and then dangling off the hypothalamus, it has this little stalk called an infundibulum. You will see that you have your pituitary gland, and your pituitary gland is housed in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So this takes us back to 2085 when we learned about the skeletal system, and you might remember that in the cranium you had this butterfly or bat-shaped bone. That was the sphenoid bone, and it had a little dip in the middle. That's the sella turcica. Well, your pituitary gland sits nicely in that sella turcica. And a fun fact, ladies, when you are pregnant because of the surge of hormones, the pituitary gland can actually increase up to 50% because of all the excessive hormones that you secrete when you are pregnant. Either way, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, my apologies. Now, the pituitary gland, it turns out, is actually composed of 2 different lobes. You have the anterior pituitary, which is the larger part of the pituitary gland. It's about 3/4 of the size of it. And then you have the posterior pituitary, which is going to be the smaller part. And what's interesting about the posterior and the anterior pituitary gland is that they're actually not physically touching. And the reason for that is because from an embryonic standpoint, they come from 2 different origins. And this is important to point out, and you can see it on your PowerPoint. It says right here, it says the posterior pituitary gland is composed of neural tissue, whereas the anterior pituitary gland is composed of glandular tissue. So it's 2 different locations that will stem off the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. And because of this, they're going to have a completely different mechanism of action. When we take a look at their hormones, they're also going to have a different way that they communicate with the hypothalamus. So we definitely want to explore the differences between that. I also want to point out that the posterior pituitary gland, which is the common name and also the scientific way of communicating it, is also called the neurohyphysis, where the anterior pituitary gland is also called the adenohyphysis. However, in medical reports, scientific papers, it's very common to just simply refer to it as the posterior and the anterior pituitary gland. Alright, so let's jump right in. Let's see what these glands are doing, what the hypothalamus is doing, and how they're communicating, and the different hormones that they are releasing. So let's start off with the posterior pituitary gland. So it turns out that the posterior pituitary gland, from an embryonic standpoint, is literally an extension of the hypothalamus, which means that it's composed of nothing but neural tissue. So we're thinking neurons, we're thinking glial cells, and because the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, or the posterior pituitary gland, are composed of the same cell types, what we see happening is that when the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary gland, it will simply just use its neurons to communicate its message from one side to the next. So it will literally just pass down the signal. It will pass down what we call its neural hormones from one side, the hypothalamus, to the other side, which is the posterior pituitary gland. And because it can use the neurons, we say that it has a hypothalamic hypophyseal tract system. And the tract part indicates the fact that we're using our neurons. So we are not going to be using the bloodstream to communicate between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. We're simply going to be using our neurons and glial cells because they are the same cell types that make up both locations. Now, it's important to point this out, and I probably should have said this a little bit earlier, that the hypothalamus has full control over which hormones are going to be released and not released in both the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. But it has a very interesting relationship with the posterior pituitary gland because it's composed of the same neural tissue. And this relationship is so special that not only does it not use the bloodstream, what we also see is that the hypothalamus will produce two hormones that it will exclusively store in the posterior pituitary gland, and it will communicate with the posterior pituitary gland when these hormones need to be released. And these hormones are going to be oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And in a little bit, we'll talk about their mechanism of action and what they contribute to the body. But for now, it's very important to notice that on the PowerPoint, what I wrote for you is that the storage and the secretion, meaning the release of the hormones, is done by the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland does not produce the hormones because these hormones are coming from the hypothalamus. So if you see, for instance, a true or false question that says the posterior pituitary gland produces two hormones, please make sure to hit false because it doesn't produce anything. It simply stores and releases these two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So here's a little illustration showing the communication pathway. As we can see, we have our neurons and our glial cells, and as you can see, it's indicating that the neural tissue basically goes from the hypothalamus over to the posterior pituitary gland. Notice how they labeled for you the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract system. So remember, we're not using the bloodstream, and it tells you right here that oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, ADH, is being produced in the hypothalamus and then will be transported down the tract system where it's going to be stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And then once the hypothalamus decides that it needs to be released, your posterior pituitary gland will go ahead and release the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, and it will travel into the bloodstream over to the target cells that are required. So the posterior pituitary gland does not produce any hormones. It simply stores the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Now, what's happening over at the anterior side? Well, the anterior pituitary gland is composed of glandular tissue. And what that means is that it is not neuron-based. So there's no neurons, no glial cells in there. Instead, what we see is that usually in embryonic development, around 4 weeks of development, in the pharynx section, which is kind of like the back of the throat section, you get a little lobe that starts to form, and that lobe will kind of pinch off and travel its way over to the infundibula and attach itself and will eventually become the anterior pituitary gland. So because it comes from, the oral, the back of the throat location, it's more of a glandular tissue. So the cells are going to be completely different than you would find in the posterior pituitary gland. Now, this is important to keep in mind because since the hypothalamus has full control over both the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland, what we see happening is that if the hypothalamus wants to communicate with the anterior pituitary gland, it's going to have to use the vascular system. because remember, in the posterior, we could have just traveled down the neurons and send our message. But since the anterior lobe is composed of completely different cell types, the hypothalamus will have to release its hormones, and these hormones will have to travel through the hypophyseal portal system. Portal means that we're using our blood vessels. So things like the primary capillary plexus, the hypophyseal portal veins, the secondary capillary plexus. Plexus and portals just means that you're using multiple blood vessels that are combining together. But either way, you have a vascular sense of communication. So the hypothalamus has to use the bloodstream to communicate with the anterior pituitary gland. And what we see happening is that the hypothalamus has 6 specific hormones that it produces that will have full control over the 6 hormones that the anterior pituitary gland is able to produce, store, and secrete. That's right, ladies and gents. The anterior pituitary gland produces all its own hormones that basically rely on the hypothalamus to tell it when the hormones are going to be released and when they're just going to stay in storage. All right, so here, take a look at this drawing. Now notice how here we're going to take a look at the communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, and notice how they went ahead and they drew a full portal system for you. So you see all the different blood vessels that are being drawn, because that is how the hypothalamus needs to communicate with the anterior pituitary gland. Now, this is what we're going to do. The hypothalamus produces 8 hormones altogether, okay? 2 of them are the ones that are going to be stored in the posterior pituitary gland, the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, right? The other 6 are going to be in full control of what happens in the anterior pituitary gland. You do not have to memorize those 6, okay? So don't worry about memorizing those 6. In fact, what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and concentrate on this purple box right here at the bottom. And this purple box is going to give us the 6 hormones that the anterior pituitary gland produces and secretes, of course, under close eye of the hypothalamus. And those hormones are going to be the growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. And what you're going to do is you're going to be able to tell me that those 6 hormones come from the anterior pituitary gland, and you're going to be able to tell me what their mechanism of action is. And we're going to all discuss this in a little bit. But I don't want you to worry about the 6 hormones that the hypothalamus produces that tells these 6 hormones when they're going to be released. So don't worry about memorizing that. Just remember that the hypothalamus, in addition to the 6 that you don't have to know, produces 2 others that sit in the posterior pituitary gland, the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Those 2 hormones we will discuss in a little bit more detail, and we're going to have a mechanism of action that attaches to those as well. Okay, so the anterior pituitary gland is made out of glandular tissue, and we need a portal system or blood vessels to communicate between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is able to produce, store, and secrete 6 hormones, and we're going to know them by name, and we're going to know their mechanism of action. I do want to point out that you're going to notice that when the hormone name is written in parentheses, there's always kind of like a little abbreviation. So like GH for growth hormone, TSH for thyroid stimulating hormone. For many of you, this might be the first time that you're learning about hormones. So I would definitely encourage for you to learn the hormone by its full name. But what I will do is that when I write my exam questions, I will include the full name and the abbreviated name as well. So whichever one you kind of become more familiar with, you'll see both of them being presented on your exam. So in case you were wondering how I'm going to write it out, I'll put the whole name and I'll put the abbreviated version as well. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and establish what exactly these hormones do. So let's go back to our posterior pituitary gland. Remember, this one doesn't produce any hormones. Instead, it's just going to store the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, that is being produced by the hypothalamus, but is being stored and released by the posterior pituitary gland. All right, so let's see what they do. I think oxytocin is a really nice one to begin with. We call oxytocin the love hormone. If you've ever been infatuated with someone, if you've ever been in love with someone, and you look at them and you get that feeling of just euphoria, that's due to oxytocin. Oxytocin has many different functions. Most of us experience oxytocin when we try to have an emotional bonding with our partners. We usually see, for instance, that oxytocin will spike after an orgasmic event. It will help us with our emotional bonding, as I mentioned to you before. Oxytocin is also often discussed in the case of natural childbirth because when a woman starts to have contractions, it's due to the fact that the brain releases oxytocin, and oxytocin will travel to the uterus and cause it to start contracting. And in this case, what we see happening is that childbirth is actually an example of a positive feedback system. So what happens is, in a perfect scenario, when it's time for the baby to come out, the baby will rotate, so its head, it's near the uterus, and it will start knocking on the uterus. And as the head interacts with the walls of the uterus sends a signal to the brain to release oxytocin. Oxytocin travels down, and it causes a contraction. Now, excuse me, if this was a negative feedback system, the minute you have one contraction, you would be good to go because that's the response you were looking for. The problem is that one contraction is not enough to get the baby out. So what we see happening is that once you have that initial contraction, we see a stronger signal being sent over to the brain, and even more oxytocin is released. And the more oxytocin you release, the stronger and the more amplified these contractions become, and the more contractions you get, the even more oxytocin is being released. So this amplification response between the response and the stimulus is an example of a positive feedback system where one causes the other to be released. And it will keep going until the mother is dilated enough that the baby can exit the body, making it sound like it's such a delicate event where the baby's head can go ahead and exit. Once the baby is born, then what we see happening is because the head is no longer hitting the uterus, that the feedback system comes to an end where no longer oxytocin is being secreted and the uterine contractions will halt. Now, the oxytocin that's now fully flowing through the bloodstream of the mother is then used for emotional bonding with her child as well as with the help of milk ejection. But the emotional bonding is really the most important part. And in fact, what we see happening, this is one of the reasons why hospitals promote skin-to-skin contact with newborns, where they place the newborns on the naked skin of the mother. And you don't have to actually have contractions for oxytocin to be released. So they will also take the newborn and they'll put it on the skin of the father, or in case there's a surrogate, they'll put it on the skin of the, I'm going to call them the birth parents, because anytime you make skin-to-skin contact, it actually releases oxytocin. So oxytocin is the love hormone. In fact, I remember reading an article, just a little thing about myself is I have a dog. His name is Chucky. It's actually Chuck Norris, but we call him Chucky. My brother named him, so that's a long story. We'll probably talk about that along the way since I like to overshare. But he is a Rottweiler Shepherd mix. He's about 125 pounds, and he is the most lovable dog ever. Obviously, I'm biased. But every time I come home, he runs up to me and he just sits there and he looks at me. And those of us who have dogs at home know that that look is just the best thing that you experience, no matter what kind of day you've had. And the dog will just look at you like they're in love with you. So in this article, it talked about the fact that the dog, when it's looking at you, is actually releasing oxytocin. So it has this emotional bond. The dog has a feeling of euphoria, of love, anytime he sees the main person that he's bonded to. So, yeah. That's oxytocin, our love hormone. So it's used for uterine contraction, but more importantly for many of us, it's the feeling of love, and it allows us for emotional bonding with our partners. The second hormone from the posterior pituitary gland is the antidiuretic hormone. A diuretic is something that allows you to increase your urine secretion. So if you're looking at a hormone that's an antidiuretic, that means it's going to lower the amount of urination, which means it allows for more water to stay inside the body. So on your PowerPoint, you're going to notice that it talks all about osmoreceptors, because osmoreceptors are going to take a look at how much solute you have floating around. Solute are small particles. Sodium is the most important one, but you can also take a look at things like chloride, calcium. Okay, so it will monitor how much solute you have, and what we see happening is that if you have too many solutes, that can often be troublesome, so we want to make sure that we add more water to the mix so that we can maintain homeostasis. So if we see that your water level is getting too low and your concentration of solute is too high, we see that your body will release antidiuretic hormone, and when it does so, we're going to see that the kidneys will reabsorb more water. And if you reabsorb more water, that means you return it back into circulation for the system, so it can go back into plasma, it can go back into the intra or extracellular fluid of the cell, and in essence what you're doing is you're increasing the water inside the body, which means that you are inhibiting or preventing urine formation. So you're going to decrease the amount of water that actually is released from the body. So it increases water retention, thus reducing urine volume, and it's an excellent way to prevent dehydration from happening. In fact, antidiuretic hormone can also cause vasoconstriction, which means that it decreases the lumen. It makes the blood vessels, the middle part of the blood vessels, a little bit smaller, which means it slows down the blood flow. And because of that, it's also called vasopressin. That's a little FYI. I always call it antidiuretic hormone. But in case you want to do a little bit more research on it, if you went ahead and looked up vasopressin, you will have the same mechanism of action because it's just another name for the antidiuretic hormone. All right, so keep in mind, posterior pituitary gland doesn't produce any hormones. It simply stores the oxytocin, our love hormone, and our antidiuretic hormone. And our antidiuretic hormone is going to return more water to the body and reduce our urine outtake. Okay, I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I want to make sure that we understand what's going on. All right, so those are your two hormones. Those two hormones should go on our table if you're making your table. And please make sure that when you discuss oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, you make a notation that it's produced by the hypothalamus and stored and secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. All right, so now let's go ahead and take a look at the anterior pituitary gland. Now remember, this one's made out of glandular tissue. It communicates through a portal system with the hypothalamus, and it produces and it will secrete all its own hormones. And we have 6 hormones to get through it. As you can see, they're numbered, and what you're going to notice is that for the first one and the last one, growth hormone and prolactin, I put a little blue asterisk, and that's because those hormones are not tropic hormones. It turns out that out of the 6 hormones that the anterior pituitary gland secretes, 4 of them are tropic hormones. Now, a tropic hormone, we mentioned this in part 1, a tropic hormone is a hormone that causes the release of a secondary hormone. So it will not produce your ultimate result. It will simply travel to a secondary location and cause that location to secrete another hormone. Now, as you look at your list, items 2 through 5 will be your tropic hormones, as they've been indicated. They're going to be your thyroid stimulating hormone. That one's going to go to the thyroid. It's all in the name, right? The adrenal corticotropic hormone. That one's going to go over to the adrenal gland. And then we have our follicle stimulating hormone and our luteinizing hormone. Those are both going to go over to the gonads. And in fact, they're often called gonadotropic hormones because not only are they going to cause the release of a hormone, making them tropic, they go over to the gonads. So if you see the mention of gonadotropic hormones, those will refer to the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. All right, so let's see what each of these does. So we're going to go in order. Let's start with growth hormone. All right, now growth hormone is a very essential hormone that we have in our body. During puberty, it will go ahead and increase its maximum secretion, and that's basically what's going to be its main purpose is going to be to increase the length and size of the body. So the growth hormone is one of the main hormones that will cause an increase in our skeletal system, in our muscular system, and it will also regulate production of our different hormonal secretions that are needed for our secondary sex characteristics and primary sex characteristics to develop. Now, before I get ahead of myself, what we see happening is that the growth hormone can have both direct and indirect actions. Its direct actions are usually focused on metabolism, and that's because it tends to have what we call a glucose-sparing action, and that will basically try to decrease the rate of cellular uptake and metabolism. And it does so because it likes to trigger the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. Glycogen is the temporary storage unit of glucose. Your body will often produce glycogen anytime you have excess food, like for instance, if you had a really nice breakfast, your body, if you're not using all the calories, will not automatically convert it into fat. It will convert it into glycogen, which are literally just glucose molecules stuck together. And then in between meals, when you get hungry, the glycogen can then quickly be broken down back into glucose, so it can fuel the individual cells for aerobic respiration, meaning that it will help them produce ATP molecules. It will also help increase blood levels of fatty acids, so we can use those fat-based molecules for fuel, and that we can use for protein synthesis as well. Now, I do want to point out that with the growth hormone, it has some indirect actions. And let's go ahead and click over to the next slide so we can kind of look at those. These indirect actions come from the fact that growth hormone has a relatively short half-life. So what it does is it produces a secondary secretion called insulin-like growth factors, IGF. And these IGFs have a longer half-life and work very similar to the original growth hormone. So it will help with cellular uptake of nutrients, it will help with collagen and deposit of bone matrix. And some people will say, well, if I have growth hormone and that growth hormone will cause the secretion of insulin-like growth factors, wouldn't growth hormone then be considered a tropic hormone? And I can see where that argument comes in, but it turns out that the answer is no. And the main reason for that is because the main mechanism, the main purpose of secreting growth hormone into our system is to concentrate on the formation and the maintenance of our bones and muscles. And the maintenance of the bones and the muscles is so important that then becomes the main function of the growth hormone. In addition, obviously, to the metabolic actions that were mentioned on the previous slide. So I definitely wanted to point out the insulin-like growth factors because these are secondary secretions from growth hormone. But please keep in mind that growth hormone is not considered a tropic hormone because its main mechanism of action will be to maintain the growth of your bone and muscles. Now, in case you're wondering, after puberty, your growth hormone will slightly decrease, and that's because it's no longer interested in overall growth, but more in maintenance of the bones and the muscles that you have. So here is just a little mechanism of action grid, and you can see our growth hormone is divided into our metabolic and maintenance, and then we have our indirect action, which will involve our insulin-like growth factors, which, like I said to you before, will work very similar to our overall growth hormone, but they have a longer half-life. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at one of the first tropic hormones. And this one's going to be our thyroid stimulating hormone. And it's all in the name, right? So your anterior pituitary gland will release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone will travel over to the thyroid. You can see the thyroid right over here. Sits a little bit below the larynx, which is your little voice box. If you take your hands and you put it in your throat, put it on the part where it's vibrating when you're talking. That is the larynx. So a little bit below that, wrapped around the trachea, your windpipe, you have your thyroid gland. And your thyroid stimulating hormone will travel over to the thyroid gland, and it will cause the release of thyroid hormone. And the thyroid hormone is then the one that will go over to the target cells, and in a little bit we'll talk about its metabolic actions that it does. But either way, what we see happening here is a perfect example of a tropic hormone, where one hormone causes the release of a secondary hormone. And if you look at your illustration right here, remember that it's the hypothalamus that's in control of when the anterior pituitary gland will secrete the thyroid stimulating hormone, and that hormone will travel to the thyroid hormone to release, will travel to the thyroid to release the thyroid hormone. And also notice that once thyroid hormone is released and interacts with its target cells, the little dashed line indicates the fact that it's a negative feedback system, meaning that once you have your results, we were going to go ahead and we're going to inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland from releasing any additional hormones. Because remember, we only want to work until we get the results. Another tropic hormone of the anterior pituitary gland is the adrenal corticotropic hormone, ACTH. Now this one is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. Now the adrenal gland, that was that little gland that sits a little bit above the kidneys. We talked about the medulla in part 1. That was the middle section. And now what we're doing is we're taking a look at the cortex section, which is the outer section of the adrenal gland. And this outer section is where your ACTH will travel to, and it will cause the release of corticosteroids. And we'll talk about the different types in our next part. But either way, what we see happening is that it's a tropic hormone because your ACTH will travel over to the cortex, and it will cause the adrenal cortex to release its own set of hormones. And these hormones are usually secreted whenever your body is in a stressful or a fight or flight type of scenario. Please keep in mind that ACTH will only work on the cortex, not on the medulla, okay? And we're going to dive more into the adrenal gland in a future part of our lecture, but it's definitely important that ACTH only goes to the cortex. All right, and then our last two tropic hormones, they're bundled together because they go over to the same location. These are going to be our gonadotropins, and they're going to be follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So both of these hormones, when they're released by the anterior pituitary gland, will travel over to the gonads. So we're talking about the testes and the ovaries. And what we see happening is that the follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the follicles. So in that case means production of the gametes, so the egg and the sperm. Whereas the luteinizing hormone is going to concentrate more on making sure that you have proper levels of gonadal hormones. So these are going to be things like your testosterone, your estrogen, your estradiol, your progesterone. And all of this, of course, is important not only for the maturing of the gametes, but also for the maintenance of the reproductive system itself. Now, notice what it says right here at the bottom. It says luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are both absent from the blood of prepubertal boys and girls. And it turns out that the reason for that is because it needs to be activated through puberty, meaning that spike in the growth hormone. That will then cause a cascading effect that will also cause an increase in luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone. And it's only when those hormones start to increase that we then see that a child goes through puberty, which means that not only do they start to develop secondary sex morphology, such as breast, widening of the hips, deepening of the voice, but that's also when a girl starts her menstruation cycle, because now you have high levels of hormones that can cause the oocyte to develop and to start ovulating, and also the production of sperms in boys. And it all has to do with the spike of LH and FSH, which then ultimately leads to a spike in estrogen and testosterone. And then our last hormone that's being produced by the anterior pituitary gland, this one is not a tropic hormone. This one is called prolactin. And when prolactin is released, it will travel directly over to the modified mammary glands of a pregnant female, and it will start stimulating milk production. Yes, even during pregnancy. And as it's producing the milk, what we see happening is that it will cause an increase of milk to develop within the glands, which often indicates that a pregnant woman's breast will start enlarging and swelling. Now, most of the time when a woman is pregnant, she doesn't actually secrete the milk, and that has to do with part of the high levels of estrogen that the uterus exhibits. That estrogen will actually have a little bit of an antagonistic effect on the prolactin, so it will prevent it from actually releasing the milk. And it's when the baby is born that that inhibition goes away, and the mother will then go ahead and respond to one of many things, including the suckling action of the baby, and will then start releasing milk production. Now, males are also able to produce prolactin, but its role is not completely understood. However, there have been cases that when the prolactin gets high enough in males, there have been cases known that they can actually induce lactation. That obviously is not as common, but there have been a few cases reported. But before I get ahead of myself, if you are writing down in your chart the mechanism of prolactin, you can just go ahead and write down milk production in females. All right, that brings us to the end of part 2. So just a quick overview. If you're making your table, you have your 2 hormones that are being stored in the posterior pituitary gland. So you have your oxytocin, you have your ADH, your antidiuretic hormone, and then you have your 6 hormones that are being produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. And when you write down the hormones, please make sure that you indicate that your thyroid stimulating hormone, your adrenal corticotropic hormone, your ACTH, your luteinizing hormone, and your follicle stimulating hormone. Please make sure to indicate that those are tropic hormones. And then the other 2 hormones from the anterior pituitary glands, those will be the growth hormone and prolactin. Those are not tropic, so just make sure that you just indicate their mechanism of action. Alrighty, so this is the end of part 2. I always need to make my statement that I'm available through email if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Please make sure to use the discussion sessions. That's a really nice way to keep everybody nicely engaged. And I will actually see you guys for part 3, hopefully sooner than later. Alright, talk soon.